In cities all across America, the benefits of home ownership has not accrued equally across race. United States housing policy has leaned heavily on home ownership as a driver of household wealth since the middle of the last century. And for many white Americans, property ownership has indeed yielded significant wealth. But Black families have largely been left behind, either unable to buy in the first place or hampered by risks that come with owning property. Why are Black lives and property devalued? Experts weigh in, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with the
My first guest is Dr. Andre Perry. He is a fellow in the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. His research focuses on race and structural inequality, education, and economic inclusion. Prior to his work at Brookings, Dr. Perry has been a founding dean, professor, award-winning journalist, and activist in the field of education. He is the author of Know Your Price: Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Perry.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. So this book, Dr. Perry, Know Your Price, is kind of memoir, kind of a manifesto, but it's about, in many ways, your own life, your own personal experiences, but it's also about, the structural racism, structural barriers that have created this huge wealth gap that we see in America between African Americans and white Americans. Why write a book that's, both personal and, manifesto? What was the impetus for this?
Yes, because one, so much of our research does not run through the lived experiences of African Americans, and many Black researchers, those working at universities and think tanks, sometimes we act as if we're not experiencing many of the situations that we write about. And so, in particular around housing discrimination, we see every day in the news how individuals are whitewashing their homes, removing all the Black artifacts in order to get a higher appraisal or greater value. But that's true of my family as well. Certainly, redlining and discrimination pushed out my family. We lived in Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania, largely a Black community, and it's not receiving the kind of investments today. My father, as I cited in the book, was murdered in prison, and what I tried to show in that book, and Know Your Price, is that if he lived in areas where the home values were at market rate, or the white would have had greater opportunity to go to college, greater opportunity to start a business, greater opportunity to move to a better neighborhood. And so his life and my life would have been different. And so that's what really motivated me to make a memoir and research, because I really want people to see that we are connected to these very issues.
Wow. Was it scary? And I don't know, that's not the right word, but to be so vulnerable, and the reason I'm asking that about, you told the story about your father, him being incarcerated. I was at an event actually last night with a woman who spent 2 years in jail. She was gang involved. Her gang affiliated boyfriend killed someone in her presence. She did 2 years, like I said, in prison. And she struggles with telling that story. And I was teasing her saying, girl, if you Black, everybody knows somebody been to jail. So I'm like, don't embrace that story. But it's so difficult for her to tell that. So how difficult was it for you, respected dean, professor, nationally recognized expert on these issues, to tell the world that, you're kind of just like you're like the guy down the street, the guy next door whose cousin, uncle, father, brother was in prison?
Well, when I was in New Orleans years ago, a little bit after the storm, I had long dreadlocks, similar to many of the youth in that area. And I spoke to a classroom one day, and I was talking about research and talking about policy and getting a PhD. And one of the students said, well, you're not like us. You didn't, you don't go through what we went through. And I explained to him that, hey, one, I was informally adopted by an older woman in the hood that took in kids. My father was murdered in jail. My mother was probably abused by him. And I really wanted him to know that my father actually should have been in my position at some point. There are lots of people in our communities that should be in a different position, and it's not their fault. One of the questions I get all the time, and it's really insulting, it's, how did you make it? How are you so different? And it's like, no, there are many people who should make it, but there are lots of people who get scooped up by the various systems. And so we really need to tell youth and adults as well, this is not your fault. This is not because of you. And I say in my book, and I say this all the time as if to keep my teeth white, there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. That constantly when things go wrong in Black neighborhoods, we blame people and not the policies that extract wealth every single day of our lives.
Yeah, and in the book, well said, and thank you for saying. I don't think we can say that enough. We got to say it for the folks in the back of the room, because not often, consistently and regularly, it is putting the blame on the victims when we talk about crime rates in urban cities, when we talk about unemployment rates, we talk about the education gap. And in your book, Know Your Price, you say this landscape of inequality is no accident, but it's by design. Help us understand, how did you go through this process of the research that really demonstrates that, yes, this is not an accident. This is purposeful.
The Anchor research report that is in this book comes about where my colleagues, Jonathan Rothwell and David Harshbarger, we did a study a few years ago that is relevant, very relevant today. We compared home prices in Black majority neighborhoods where the share of the Black population is 50% or higher. And we compared them to home prices in neighborhoods where the share of the Black population is less than 1%. And a lot of people know that homes in Black neighborhoods are priced lower, but they'll say that's because of education, that's because of crime, that's because of personal choice. But those are things
because we don't keep our property up. We hear that
right.
too.
That's right. But those are things you can control for in a study. And that's what we did. We took that the price difference between homes in Black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods, but we controlled for the size of the home, the physical characteristics, and we controlled for education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics, because we wanted to get an apples to apples comparison between homes in Black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods. And what we found pretty much astounds that homes in Black neighborhoods are underpriced by 23%, about $48,000 per home. Cumulatively, that's about $156 billion in lost equity, $156 billion. And just to put that in perspective, $156 billion would have financed more than 8 million four-year degrees based upon the average amount of a four-year public education. It would have paid for more than 4 million Black-owned businesses based upon the average amount Black people use to start their firms, replace the pipes in Flint, Michigan, 3,000 times over. It's more than double the annual economic burden of the opioid crisis. It's a big number. And so when I going back to my father lived in neighborhoods in which the homes were at market rate or the white rate. He would have had greater opportunity. And so for me, this is about not blaming people anymore. It's about looking at the structures that extract wealth every single day.
And Professor Perry, when you said Black homes in Black neighborhoods are devalued by 23%, and you said you control for education and all these other factors, what's the reason?
Well, clearly the perception of Black neighborhoods, that Blackness is it degrades or devalues a home. And this is what you're seeing all across the country in these experiments, when families are getting their home refinanced, they get an appraisal, it comes in low, they get their white friends to stand in for them, they remove all the Black artwork and books, they even remove the hair products in the shower. And what you get there is the intrinsic value of whiteness. And so for me, it's about we shouldn't have to whitewash our home. That strips dignity and everything else.
Right.
We need policy to really address these issues. I just want to be clear about this. This is theft. When you're losing tens of thousands of dollars, the couple in Marin County in Northern California lost $500,000 from an appraisal. 500,000.
Yeah, I had him on the show. I had a chance to sit down and talk with him right after that incident had happened, before they filed the lawsuit that was recently filed, and it was just mind blowing. It was
mind blowing. 500,000 in different parts of the country, that can literally change someone's life overnight. I mean, there's some communities you can live off of that for decades.
Yes, absolutely.
So this is theft. And so, but that's just a metaphor of the devaluation that occurs in different sectors of our lives, in business, in infrastructure, and so on and so forth.
So I know in the book you tells a story about growing up yourself in a majority Black Wilkinsburg, and you also focus on some other cities: Detroit, Birmingham, New Orleans, Atlanta, and Washington. Why those cities, and then what did you find in those cities?
Yeah, I studied those cities because I have a personal connection with those cities, but I also see a lot of similarities between them. And I also wanted to show how those assets in those cities are also devalued. We know that businesses, for instance, in Birmingham are devalued. We see that also in Atlanta and other places. Just to reference another study that my colleagues did and I did, we scraped all the Yelp data for businesses across the country, and we found that Black, Brown, and Asian businesses actually score higher on Yelp than their white counterparts.
Really?
But they get less stars and revenue as they are situated in Blacker neighborhoods, showing how the perception of neighborhood is distorting markets. In New Orleans, we saw after the storm, Black teachers get fired en masse. In order to quote unquote improve education. And we know from the research that Black teachers actually add academic value. In our study of DC, we see how gentrification is leading to the scrubbing of Blackness from the nation's capital. Appraisal issues in Birmingham is run amok, throttling the economic growth in the commercial corridors. I mean, so all across the country in this, what I try to show in this book is not just about housing, that there are assets in communities that are impacted really because of the concentration of Blackness. If these assets were surrounded by mostly white people, they would receive much more investment. And so we really just have to show that our assets are much more valuable than they are priced, so to speak, so we can get to investment.
And how do we do that? Dr. Perry, how do we demonstrate the intrinsic value of these assets? Since, you're saying society has this perception that because it's Black and is surrounded by Blackness, that it is inherently worth less. How do we debunk that and demonstrate the value of our assets?
There's really only one way to do that, and that's through investment. When people invest and establish trust and see returns that we have not realized before, then they can really begin to see the true value. And in essence, I study underappreciated assets, meaning the assets that if you just added water, it would grow. Just to give you an example, Black people represent about 14% of the U.S. population, but only have about 2% of the nation's employer firms, meaning firms with more than one employee. If the number or the percentage of Black firms equal the Black population, we would have 800,000 more Black businesses in America. 800,000, trillions added to the economy. But when we don't invest, you get what you get. And so, and this is no slight to many of the recovery programs, but equity is stimulus, true stimulus. If you invest in equity, Black people would be able to better withstand the economic shocks that will occur, always occur. But we ultimately must invest in these assets to provide the protection we deserve.
So, Dr. Perry, you're talking about, when I think of investment, I'm thinking of something that's proactive. What we've actually seen in this country is disinvestment. That's true. So, I mean, and we think about equity. Can we get to equity even if we started now with policies? Because wouldn't we need some form of reparations? Because we're in the hole, we're in the negative right now.
Oh, absolutely. Not only must we remove the drags of racism from current policy, we need some kind of stimulus. After the pandemic really set in, you saw the business community say, hey, you forced us to close our shops. We deserve to be made whole.
Right.
So what does a stimulus package look like for a population that has been socially distanced for generations? What do we deserve? You can call it reparations, you can call it stimulus, you can call it what it is. But there was damage done by these past policies, by slavery, by Jim Crow racism, by housing discrimination, by a biased criminal justice system that is far more pronounced than closing shops for the months during the pandemic. And so just as folks demanded their claim, we should have ours. But again, I just want to say that when you invest in Black communities, you invest in everyone. That investing in Black communities will grow the proverbial pie. Everyone would benefit. So it's not a matter of taking away from white people when you invest in Black.
Well, I'm glad you used the word stimulus, because we know the word reparation, is loaded and triggers a lot of people and creates for a lot of people, lots of, contentious debate. But help us understand, how do we frame this concept of stimulus, to take it out of this politically charged, debate that happens over reparations? I was talking to a white woman that I'm working with actually, and she associated reparations with somehow trying to, express remorse or sorrow for slavery, and was saying that, money could never obviously, compensate African Americans for slavery. So how do we, disabuse people of any notion that this stimulus is about trying to make amends for slavery, versus what you're saying, that it's making amends for decades of policies that have, served as an impediment to Black wealth, Black progress?
Well, the purest form of reparation does both. That it acknowledges the harms that was done by slavery and through a congressional act, and it provides some remediation or some remuneration, I should say, for past atrocities, particularly slavery. But it should address the harms of federal policy, that federal, state, and local policy that hurt African Americans. And
so, let me stop you there. But do you think? I mean, can we separate the two? Can they be separated? Can we say, okay, those folks who don't want to deal with making any kind of, acknowledgement about the harms of slavery? Maybe it's like, I'm a lawyer, so sometimes you settle a lawsuit and nobody's admitting liability.
Right.
You don't admit liability, but you pay me $10 million. So, I don't really care about you refusing to admit liability, but you're going to make me whole financially with this monetary settlement. Can we think about stimulus in that way, that maybe we're not going to get the acknowledgement of the moral atrocity of slavery, but we're going to get the financial investment that's going to make us whole?
Well, there's certainly people who will latch on to different arguments made, but I'll point you to the research that shows that actually support for reparation is growing significantly every single year. And so people are just starting to learn the importance of structural racism on our economy. And they're starting to learn the moral debt that is owed to this. And so it's a slow process. However, I think it's more likely you'll see reparations occur when people actually come to grips with the damage that was done. And so, yes, there are always going to be people who say, I didn't own any slaves. I'm not responsible. And by the way, we're not asking individuals
Right.
to pay reparations. We're asking the federal government to pay reparations. But, I think ultimately we're better off when people actually understand the history of slavery, Jim Crow racism, and historic discrimination. But there's obviously going to be some people who want to make another argument, and there's room for more economic arguments in this debate.
Dr. Perry, this book, in many ways, is an indictment on, white culture that has historically blamed the victims of racism, for the consequences of racism and oppression. It seems like after George Floyd was murdered last year, in 2020, and we, had the civil unrest, people were willing to hear that. They were willing to accept to some extent that this country had a problem, called systemic and structural racism. But many of my guests that I've had on the show over the last 18 months have said that that moment did not turn into a movement, and that, in fact, we saw, the support wane significantly for Black Lives Matter, and even for, talking about and trying to be proactive on some of these policies. How is what you're saying now in this, 18 months now, or however many months we are since George Floyd's murder, are you speaking to a receptive audience? Are you finding that your audience, whether it's scholars, I'm not sure who your targeted audience is, folks like me that are very interested in this topic, but are people still willing to hear this message?
Actually, yes. I actually just spoke to the National Association of County Executives about this matter. Because counties are dealing with the issue of devaluation. They're losing revenue because home values are not what they should be, and so for my work, actually, it has heightened since the unrest, the uprising, and it has continued. The demand for answers it's still there, and it's going to last a long time. Certainly. The marches and some of the more explicit forms of protest will wane. There'll be peaks and valleys on that. But what I'm seeing across the country are people going to work, actually developing solutions that will ultimately restore value that's been extracted by racism.
Well, what are some of those solutions that you're seeing? And can you give us some examples of counties or cities where this is happening?
Yeah, I'll just stay on the appraisal front. You saw the President Biden introduce a interagency task force on appraisals recently, and they're going to come up with some solutions there. Freddie and Fannie, the government-sponsored enterprises that holds most of the mortgages and keeps them liquid, they're instituting policy change. If we can get this Build Back Better bill off the ground, where we can see money going towards counties and cities, they will be able to establish home ownership program. We have also seen on the business development front a lot more investment from corporations into small businesses. We have got to provide more concrete goals to scale up businesses to get that number of the 2% of employer firms that I talked about earlier up to 14%. And that requires more targeted goals, not just saying we should support Black businesses, but we should support Black businesses at a scale that will increase revenue and employment. And so that's what I think is the next level. So I think people have recognized that, and they are investing in Black businesses. We're seeing an increase in that, but it's not targeted yet. And so we still need to continue that and to continue to put the pressure on. But quite frankly, the protests should not stop. Like many of the gains that we saw are the result of people marching in the street. And when you stop making a demand, people stop acting.
But how do you juxtapose what you just described, Dr. Perry, with what we are seeing happening in the country in terms of oppressive voter suppression laws, laws being passed in states about, prohibiting schools from teaching about racism. So you just, laid out what appeared to be tremendous progress, support for addressing structural racism in an area of housing. But we juxtapose that against what we see appears to be a tremendous backlash that's happening since the civil unrest, since the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris.
Well, it's clear that you can have progress and backlash. In fact, the backlash is a sign of progress. You would not see these kind of actions if a certain group did not recognize that there's a change in power. And so for me, yes, there's going to be backlash. There's always a backlash. Whenever there was any kind of movement forward, there was a headwind that emerged shortly after. And so we're going to have to deal with the backlash.
As a historian, as someone who's been studying this for decades, have you ever seen a backlash to the extent that we are witnessing it today? And I include in that the January, insurrection and the big lie about, 68% of Republicans who won't even acknowledge that Joe Biden is legitimately elected president.
But let's not forget, the biggest backlash was the end of Reconstruction. You also had the 1954 Brown v. Board decision and the busing backlash. Remember, busing became a dirty word.
I wasn't born then, Dr. Perry.
But we all dealt with the consequences of that.
A little levity. I'm being serious. Keep going.
But we all dealt with the consequences of that. And so there throughout history, we've seen tremendous backlash to progress. And I also need to always remind myself and others of this. The successes we saw during 2020 and a certain extent now was a result of the work that occurred 30, 40 years ago. And the work that I'm doing now will not show up next year, 3 years from now. It'll occur 20, 30 years from now. So we still have to put these things in historical context, that there is progress, but you don't see the fruit of that labor until much later.
Yeah. And that's an excellent point. And, I just want to go back to the point you made about investing in Black businesses, getting Black businesses from that 2% to that 14%, is going to expand this economy by trillions of dollars. How do we get folks, and there's just a study out that shows the majority of the people that participated in the insurrection and who supported, whether they were there or not, all fall into this category of people that believe in this whole kind of notion of this displacement theory. They believe they're being displaced and that something is being taken away from them, and they've got to fight, including using physical violence to hold on to what they believe is being stripped away from them. The browning of the country, the minority becoming the majority. So how do we convey this message that this isn't displacing you, this is growing a pot that you too will benefit from?
Well, there's always been a misinformation campaign leveled against all people, white people, Black people, and we're seeing that today, because to maintain racism is to essentially promote a lie. You almost have to do that. I believe, and I work at a think tank, I believe we have to consistently produce truth. Even in the thick of misinformation, even in the thick of lies, we must consistently produce truth, and we must be trusted to disseminate truth. One of the reasons why people believe any kind of conspiracy theory is because they don't necessarily trust the information that's coming out of people's mouths. So we have got to establish trust. Then there's another thing. We do need to have courageous conversations with people whom we don't agree with. We need to have those kind of in-depth conversations with folks who do believe in the lie, that do believe that the election was rigged, that believe the vaccines magnetize you somehow. We need that conversation. But then finally, if that producing facts, having conversations don't work, and you start to feel exhausted and you start to expend too much energy, we've got to ignore people. And including the media. And so there's some people we just give way too much attention to. And so after you present the facts, after you have the conversations, and that doesn't work, ignore them. And I don't care if they were a former president or a neighbor or somebody who constantly is putting out misinformation on the internet, block them. Yeah. And so at some point, we can't lose our self-worth, our energy to constantly defend truth.
And that's an excellent point, because what happens sometimes in those conversations, I was having one last night with someone, a wealthy white man who said a very prominent Black woman whose name I won't use, but we all know and love, said that she was owned by a studio. And I said, ooh, that's a deep word. We don't use that word anymore.
That's right.
Oh, like, okay, that's a pretty charged word to say to a Black woman about another Black woman. So, but to your point, yes, some people have to be ignored because there's so much gaslighting that happens. Sometimes you'll start thinking that, what you know to be truth is no longer the truth because, the folk you're talking to have bought into the conspiracy theory and they're so deep in it that they start to sound convincing. So we got to stand in our truths and know that ain't nobody owned in this country, right now, here today. And we don't accept that in any, form or fashion. But I just want to thank you. Really insightful conversation. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Your book, again, is Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. If you're a student of history, if you care about Black communities, if you live in a Black neighborhood, if you're a Black person, get this book because it's an important book for you. And if you're not a Black person and you want to know what's happening in this country and how you can help grow the pie, so you can also be lifted up through this process, this is a perfect book for you as well. And again, thank you, Dr. Perry. Keep doing this great work. Keep speaking truth to power. Keep laying that foundation. So maybe not in this generation, but our kids, our grandkids, our great-great-grandkids will look back and know that it was folks like you that made it possible for us to get from that 2% to that 14% business owner. And as a business owner myself, that would be just like, music to my ears. So.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me and keep up the good work.
All right. All right. What an enlightening conversation with Dr. Andre Perry. He is the most renowned expert on this whole issue of devaluing of property in Black neighborhoods. My next guest is Vanessa Gregory. She's a journalist whose writings focus on immigration, historical memory, and race. She's a contributor to the New York Times Magazine and a professor of journalism at the University of Mississippi. And she actually interviewed Dr. Perry for a really insightful article that she wrote about 2 weeks ago in the New York Times entitled How the Real Estate Boom Left Black Neighborhoods Behind. Good morning and welcome to the show, Vanessa.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure to talk with you after having spent about 25-30 minutes with Dr. Perry and just, learning from him about the incredible work and research he's been doing. And then I know he's a big part of the article that you wrote, but I want to start by asking you why this article in this moment, how the real estate boom left Black neighborhoods behind. What prompted you to write this?
Well, it started with curiosity about Orange Mound itself. So Orange Mound is a historically Black neighborhood in Memphis, Tennessee. It has an incredible, rich, overlooked, I would say nationally, history. And the neighborhood lost, between 2009 and 2019, home values there plunged by about 30%, which of course, if you are a homeowner, creates a huge problem in terms of wealth, in terms of being able to access money to repair your home, in terms of being able to borrow and send kids to college or to start a business. And the great paradox about Orange Mound is that this is a neighborhood where people did everything right for generations. People built schools, churches, businesses, and there is a strong and continuing tradition of homeownership and pride in homeownership. And so when I think back on what Dr. Perry said about blaming individuals, here's a neighborhood where you really can't do that. And so I got very curious about what was going on and why we were seeing this loss of wealth.
Yeah, you give a great example of a homeowner. Her name is Paula Campbell. a house she paid cash for $330,000 just 2017, so not that long ago. And her house now is valued only at $150,000. So she is upside down in that house, in like almost half the value has been lost in such a short period of time. Do you have any explanation as to why that percentage seems to be even greater than Dr. Perry talked about Black homeowners in Black neighborhoods seeing about a 23% decrease in value, but clearly Miss Campbell's house far exceeds that 23%.
Well, Miss Campbell is a remarkable woman, first of all, and she's someone who sees the value in Orange Mound. She grew up there. She built her house on the street where she was raised. Her grandparents' house still stands across the street, and she can see it from her front yard. And she's a smart woman. She knew that this might not be the best financial investment, but she believes in the neighborhood. And if you want to talk about some of the reasons that Orange Mounds experienced so many declines, well, we have to go back 130 years. You know, Dr. Perry talked about his research that shows that even if you control for quote unquote objective factors like housing quality stock, like the quality of education, like crime, that you're still seeing a difference in home prices in white and Black neighborhoods. But in a neighborhood like Orange Mound, where you do have poverty and you do have a number of abandoned and neglected properties, it's really important to also track through that history that has pressed on this neighborhood for 130 years and understand the ways that systemic racism has shaped it, and really try to get a sense of the degree to which the odds have been shaped, the odds have been stacked against a neighborhood like Orange Mound and against many Black neighborhoods in America.
Yeah, as I was listening to Dr. Perry, I was just reminded, I live here in Los Angeles, and there are two very prominent Black neighborhoods in Los Angeles. There are others, but the two that come to mind is a community called Baldwin Hills and a community called View Park. And I guess the third one comes to mind where I actually used to live is called Ladera Heights. And these are neighborhoods historically Black royalty, I'll say, live there, entertainers, sports figures, prominent physicians, lawyers. And still, those are the homeowners in these neighborhoods. And they are in prime property because the Baldwin Hills community, View Park, they have views of all of Los Angeles. I mean, the kinds of views that people pay millions and millions of dollars, to the kind of views that give your home those kinds of accelerated values. And a home in one of these Black neighborhoods, maybe the values now are around $1 million, $2 million. But if those same homes were put in Beverly Hills, put in Pacific Palisades, put in all white communities in Los Angeles County, they would have, astronomically higher values. And I was sitting here trying to think, what is the reason? You have educated African Americans, you have home ownership, you have great views, you have prime property. And it's just this notion that you and Dr. Perry talk about simply because they're Black neighborhoods. That is really that's hard. That's hard to accept. That's hard to believe. You guys have done the research, so we know you're not making it up. And I lived in Ladera Heights in Los Angeles, so I knew it was next door to a neighborhood called Westchester. The homes weren't even as nice as the homes in my neighborhood, Ladera Heights, but yet they had a higher property value simply because that Westchester neighborhood was a white neighborhood versus Ladera Heights, which, again, doctors, lawyers, business owners, school superintendents, you name it, they lived in my neighborhood, but yet our homes were valued at less. Is that just all over this country? Is that the phenomenon that's happening all over this country?
Well, if you take Orange Mound as a case study, and I do think it is representative of Black neighborhoods in cities across America, you can trace disinvestment back to the 1930s. And you mentioned redlining earlier, and Orange Mound was indeed redlined. Right, so most of us know what redlining is by now, right? These were the maps produced by the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation that labeled neighborhoods as high risk, and they were institutionalized discrimination. We tend to think back on redlining and think, wow, it would have been hard for individuals to buy homes. But this also it changed where money flowed in cities and who got the money, right? And so not only was it individual homeowners, but it was also businesses. And so monies that banks might have been spending in a Black neighborhood they went to white neighborhoods. 1968, the Fair Housing Act was enacted that eliminated that type of blatant discrimination. But at the same time, we had a lot of social, political factors that were also conspiring against places like Orange Mound. So in Memphis in the early 70s, the federal government finally forced the city to desegregate its schools. It was very resistant. And the white flight was just incredible. It was fast and it was furious from the city. And as white people left the city and went to the suburbs, I see you've got Councilmember Jones coming on later, the city supported that flight. This wasn't just individuals making choices, but the city's utility companies were supporting power lines and water lines out to those places with the tax dollars of people who lived in neighborhoods like Orange Mound, right? And so these neighborhoods aged, and investment, meanwhile, was going to build new places when maybe they needed their pipes rehabbed or they needed street lamps. And, also in the 70s on a national level, Princeton sociologists I spoke to described the way we've changed our federal investment in cities as a strategy of abandonment and punishment. So we started spending far less money as a country on the types of things that make cities and neighborhoods great. Schools, social programs, social supports for individuals who are out of work, and we started investing in the criminal justice system. This all affected individuals in the community of Orange Mound, in Black neighborhoods across the country. And as we came out into the 90s and into the 2000s, we had this subprime lending crisis that also really hammered neighborhoods of color. And if you drive through Orange Mound today, you'll see a number of homes that have been torn down. And so many of those are the results of the foreclosure crisis.
Yeah. Dr. Perry said in his book, he says that Black people are not broken. Our homes are not broken, but they are devalued. And he says we need to change the policies to change that process. I want to bring into the conversation now City Council member Martavius Jones. He sits on the City Council for the City of Memphis. Good morning and welcome, Council Member Jones.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Dr. Perry talks about changing policy, and you sit on a city council, and city councils are responsible for policies within a city. Do you agree with Dr. Perry that so much of what we're talking about today, this devaluing of Black properties and Black businesses and Black neighborhoods, is policy driven? And, what are the policies that need to happen at the local level to change this devaluing?
It largely is, and good to see you again, Dr. Gregory, and I appreciated the article that was in the New York Times. I grew up in Memphis. My first 18 years of life, I lived in Memphis, Tennessee, didn't know anything but. Lived away for about 13 years, but came home. And if it were not for Orange Mound, I wouldn't be here. Both of my parents attended the flagship high school in that community is called Melrose High School. My mom and dad are both proud graduates of Melrose High School. But as I grew up in Memphis and coming back and seeing what would be the eastward migration and move from the core of the city to east, I saw the crumbling infrastructure left in the core city of Memphis over the years. And so I've tried to, I really didn't have any political ambitions when I returned to Memphis, but seeing how we have not really done anything to sort of reverse those trends, it's like we're swimming upstream to try to reverse some of those policies that are done so. But at the end of the day, I still say that what we lack collectively is the collective will to do anything different. There's 13 members on the city council. We have a council, an attorney that advises the city council, and he's advised us. 7 votes can do anything. We just haven't had the collective will to move in the right direction, in my opinion.
And one of the things that your article says, Dr. Gregory, is that a city like Orange Mound, a community like Orange Mound, needs $1 billion over several decades to transform it. How likely is that, City Council Member Jones, since you just said you can't get 7 votes, is it likely? I mean, obviously that investment, I presume, Dr. Gregory, that would come from both federal, state, and local dollars. It wouldn't all be coming directly from the city. but how do we even move government, the collective government, to make that kind of investment in a community like Orange Mound?
Well, that figure would also include private dollars, but would certainly include subsidies from cities and from the feds and from the state. So the economist I talked to about that is an expert in redeveloping neighborhoods. And a point he made that I think is really salient is that we can keep putting a couple $1 million into this neighborhood there or this neighborhood there, and it might work. I do think it's possible that Orange Mound could see some real progress in coming years. There's a degree of commitment there from the Shelby County property assessor, Melvin Burgess, who's trying to launch a redevelopment. And there are some exciting things happening in terms of plans to redevelop buildings within the area and to support homeowners. But if we really want to move the needle for cities, we've got to have investments in the people within these neighborhoods, which is something that Dr. Perry says. So we need these targeted programs that would target Black neighborhoods and that would target homeowners and that would support infrastructure programs and smart redevelopment. But this piecemeal neighborhood by neighborhood approach, it just means we're always going to leave someone out. And if you look at a place like Memphis, that's especially true because it's not a dense city, it's a sprawling city. And there are so many neighborhoods and private investors have so much choice about where they go. So they can just follow that hot neighborhood to the hot neighborhood. And meanwhile, you have all these people who need help with healthcare, with jobs, with education, with childcare, all the things that people need so that they can be fully realized human beings who can then create fully realized communities.
Councilmember Jones, are you encouraged by what you see happening in Washington? And I don't mean all the partisan bickering, but at least the passage of the infrastructure bill, and perhaps we're on the verge of the passage of Build Back Better. Do the passage of those bills portend something good happening for the city of Memphis in terms of investment that would allow the city to invest in some of these poor, well, they're not really poor, but these neighborhoods that have seen white flight and that need, obviously, investment?
I would say that I'm hopeful. I'm not quite encouraged, but I am hopeful. The old saying, hope springs eternal. I'm hopeful and not really encouraged by this based upon some of the decisions that I say we collectively, because once a vote is taken, I'm part of that decision as well.
Right.
In my opinion, with some of the money that we've received from the federal government under the American Recovery Plan, under the CARES Act, in my opinion, we did not make enough investment in people. So what Dr. Greg is talking about, making some of those investments, we've had opportunities to do so. What I feel that we've done here at the local level, that's why I still remain hopeful, we've used federal funds to sort of supplant what should be done on a local basis in spending federal money on things that we should have addressed when we talk about the tax rate. So what I try to impress upon my colleagues is that taxes equal services. We live in a poor city, and we need to, and everything is tied to, everything is sort of interconnected or interrelated. We've built an industry, we've prided ourselves in being the distribution capital of the world. FedEx is based here. UPS has a large operation here. A lot of companies have their warehouses here to be in close proximity to the distribution companies like the FedEx, like the UPSs. However, that takes manual labor, and the rate of pay that's associated with that industry, unfortunately, isn't very high. When we talk about these low incomes, those low incomes translate into the ability to borrow, the ability to purchase a home. So if we have a large population where our population is so much in poverty, they're not going to be able to go to Orange Mound or any place else and offer a greater offering price for these homes. So we have to start with our wages. We have to start with the companies that we incentivize to come here. And until we make those difficult decisions, I'm not encouraged, but I still remain hopeful.
Well, we've got to leave it there, Dr. Gregory and Councilmember Jones. Thank you so much both for sharing the story of Memphis and helping us see how that story is not just the story of Memphis, it's actually the story of cities all over this country. Again, thank you for joining us and for sharing this really important and insightful information.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I want to thank all of my guests this morning. This is such a fascinating topic. Like I said, as I was talking to Dr. Perry, I started to think about the neighborhood where I bought my first home here in Los Angeles, that Ladera Heights neighborhood. Beautiful neighborhood, ranch-style homes, beautiful backyards, swimming pools, 3-4 bedroom homes, homes that literally, if they were just taken out of that community that is predominantly African American and put in a white community in LA County, the value of a house that maybe I bought for $300,000 would be worth $3 million. I mean, that's the differences that we're talking about in a city like LA, where the housing market is so incredibly high. And you have to think, why is that? We were good homeowners. We kept our property up. We mowed our lawn. We watered our grass. We painted the house. We did all the things that you're supposed to do to keep the neighborhood, intact. And so did our neighbors. They all did the same things too. It still is a beautiful neighborhood. I still have lots of friends that live there. But simply because of our skin color, simply because we are Black, simply because we are Black families, Black homeowners, our property values were and are to this day, less. The neighborhood is valued less than our white counterparts. There's something so incredibly wrong about that. And when you see it in stark terms, the way Dr. Perry has laid it out and the way Dr. Gregory lays it out in that article, that really brilliant New York Times article, it should make you mad. It makes me mad. It makes me angry to think that we live in a country that in 2021 that we can still have such disparities when, as Dr. Gregory just said, we did everything right. The homeowners in Orange Mound did everything right. Me and my neighbors in Ladera Heights, we did everything right. We worked hard. We got our down payment. We bought our home. We paid our mortgage. We paid our taxes on our property taxes. We kept the house up. We did everything right. But simply because we're Black people, our homes are worth less. I got to let that sit with me. That's bothering me. I just have to be honest about it. That is bothering me. But before I get out, some words to live by. And these are from Dr. Andre Perry. Very insightful and astute words. He said, "There is nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve." Let me say that again, because that's powerful. There is nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. I'm Archie. Be safe out there. Wear your mask, get your booster shot, and remember, we are all in this together.